All right, CNT125 Risk Management Lab. We just got done getting our network up and functioning. We made sure that we had saw networks in the routing table, and we're making sure we could ping through the network. So again, make sure all that functions before we add anything else. The next section, we're going to start adding some of our first pieces of security. We're going to put some passwords on for the privilege mode. We're going to create a user account, and then we're going to enable Telnet on the switches, and we're going to enable SSH for the routers, and that's going to allow us to do some protocol tests later to see which one is secure, which one is not secure. So I've cabled into my I'm into my top switch here. So on my top switch, I'm going to start putting some passwords in. So let's do enable config T. Once I'm here, the first thing I'm going to put in is my password for the enable mode. Okay, let's understand what we're doing before we do it. When I first log into my switch, I'm at this user mode prompt here. When I'm going to get to the privilege mode, I use the enable command. And when I type enable, my prompt changes and gets me to the privilege mode. Well, we're about to put a password here that when somebody tries to go from the enable mode or the basic user mode up to the privilege mode or the admin mode, if you will, they're going to get prompted for a password. So if they're not an admin, they're not going to be able to get to the level on this device that can make changes. So we're about to put a password right there to stop people from getting into the switch to making changes, is what it amounts to. So over here, we'll do config T. Config T, and now we're going to do the command is enable secret class. Now, whenever you're typing in a password, slow down, be deliberate, double check and triple check before you hit the enter key. So let's understand what we're typing. We're typing enable secret class. Okay, so the command is saying, hey, for the enable mode, please put a password on. Please encrypt the password. That's what secret means. Please encrypt the password and then set the password as blah, whatever this last word is. So set the enable mode password. Please encrypt it so Joe Schmo can't read it. And then set it to blah. In this case, we're setting it to the word class. That is a default password we use in our labs so that if people forget, we usually know what it is to get in and we don't have an issue. So it is not a secure password. We know that. You know, you'd have uppercase, lowercase characters, etc. But in the lab for learning purposes, we're using a very basic password of class. And we're all going to use that, please. Now, before I hit enter, I'm double checking for typos. I'm making sure I have the full word class. I'm making sure I don't have this kind of scenario. And I'm making sure I don't have a scenario where I have spaces out here, because the spaces would become part of the password. So before I hit enter, I am literally checking every character of my command, and I'm going to hit enter. If I were to discover a typo, let's say I did have this, and a space on the end, and I hit enter, and I'm like, ooh, before you go any further, fix that, and hit enter, and overwrite the bad one. Get it in there correct now. Because we have just set a password on the enable mode that if I were to leave the switch and come back in, so I do enable, it now says, what's the password? So for me to change anything, I need the password. And if I forget what it is, I've just locked myself out of my switch and I can't get in to change anything. So make sure you have typed it correctly and not made an error. I'm going to exit one more time and show you. When we go to enable mode, it prompts for the password, and I'm going to type the word class, C-L-A-S-S. You notice the cursor does not move. The cursor's not moving, so that helps with preventing somebody shoulder surfing to see how many characters your password was. So I literally need to type the word class with confidence because the cursor is not going to move for me. All right, that's what we just set there. That's what we just set, the enable secret class password. And if I do a show run, I will see, here it is. Here's the enable password encrypted. Here's the word class encrypted. Okay, that's what we just set. All right, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a user account on here that we're going to use for people remoting in. So config T. Username, I'm going to use my first name. I would use your first name. or a, kind of a generic first name like Fred or Bob or something really easy, or Sally, something easy that you could repeat throughout the lab, okay? But I'm using my first name, and I'm setting the password to password, okay? Again, I know these are not secure passwords, but for learning purposes, we're putting basic ones in that we could easily try to plug in if we forget. So I'm setting the username to Doug. I'm setting the password to password. That's what that is going to do. Again, double check. If you have an error, hit the up arrow, fix it, enter, and fix it. Okay? Username of Doug, password of password. Now we're going to use that when we enable remote access. So on my switch, my switches are old enough that they're not going to allow SSH, which is actually fine. We're going to use Telnet older protocol, and we're going to see the vulnerabilities with Telnet. That's what we're going to see when we test later. So we're going to enable Telnet on here. So we're going to say line VTY 015. We're saying, hey, the virtual terminals, I want to configure them. I want to enable them and configure them. That's what the VTY is, virtual terminals. We are going to say transport input Telnet. So we're saying, hey, on these virtual terminals, enable Telnet. And we're then going to say, hey, if the person wants to log in, they have to use this local account that we created. Login local. We're going to prompt them for a login, and they need to provide the credentials for this local account that we just created. Okay? So that's what that's going to do. So now when somebody tries to remote in with Telnet, they will need to supply this local account. Exit, exit. I'm going to do a show run. And what I'll see in here, oops, I scrolled right by it. There's my username, Doug, password, password. I'm going to go down to the bottom. Here's my virtual terminals enabled. And they do split them in half, 0 to 4 and 5 to 15. Okay, that's what the OS does. And then we had transport input Telnet. And that is showing that we are enabled Telnet on these virtual terminals. And we're also saying, hey, they need to supply the local account to log in. All right, I will do a copy run start on this guy. And I'm going to repeat that on the other switch. Do that on the other switch. I did that previously, so make sure you do your other switch. I'm now going to move on to my router. So I'm going to move my console cable into my 2011, and I'm going to do a similar function on the router. So I'm going to do, here's my 2011, enable, config T. I'm going to set my enable password to class. Again, we're going to use that password on all of our devices. So for learning purposes, we can easily get in and fix things. Enable secret class. I'm double checking typos. So I've set that. I'm going to create again another user account. Username, Doug, password, password. Again, this is a local account. It's local on this device. In real life, you might actually do this on an account server and have the router or switch reference that server. Okay, since we don't have that set up, we're just creating local accounts on each of the devices that need to be used for somebody to access. Well, our routers are newer than our switches, so we're going to enable SSH on the routers. So to do that, we need to first create an encryption key. So IP domain name CNT.org. This is needed to create our encryption key. We need the name in here, and then we're going to create the actual encryption key. Crypto key generate RSA. It's going to ask us, do we want to use 512? We're going to use 1024. We need that for a future lab. We need a higher encryption key for a future lab. So we're doing that now. So I create the domain name and the encryption key. Those pieces are needed together to create the encryption key. So now when somebody goes to connect, they will have to accept the RSA encryption key to communicate via SSH. We're then going to enable our virtual terminals just like we did on the switch, line VTY 015. This time we're going to say transport input SSH this time instead of Telnet. And we're going to also again say please use the local account that we created. The person needs to provide the credentials for this local account to access this router remotely. We'll do an exit, show run, and we're going to double check. Here is my enable secret. There's the word class encrypted. Here's my username and password, Doug and password. If I go down here to the bottom, I will see my SSH on my virtual terminals. And again, it splits it, the first chunk and then the last chunk. That's just what the OS is doing. I will do a copy, run, start on this guy as well. Okay, so we have real quickly, and what you'll need to do now is move your console cable to the 4221 and repeat this process on the 4221. I did that previously, so I already have that done on mine, but make sure you move over and do your other router as well. Now, real quickly, we put on the switches, we put an enable password so people cannot get to the privilege mode without providing a password, and we've created a local account and enabled remote access on the switch via telnet. And on the router, we've done the same process, but we enabled remote access via SSH. And that's going to allow us to compare these two protocols as we start working in our network. So there is our basic password access security on our switches and routers, and then we've enabled remote access. We'll come back in the next podcast and deal with some more remote access in our network. Alrighty, while I'm here, I did actually have a couple minutes left in this podcast. While I'm here, I'm going to enable remote access on my client. So let me show you how to do that. We're actually going to do it on this PC number 2, the one on, kind of like the right side of your network. So in this case, it's the other PC. It's not the one I'm on. But let me show you the process. On this PC, I'm going to enable RDP. So we're going to enable access to this PC via RDP, Remote Desktop Protocol. So to do that, I'm going to click on Windows icon. I'm going to go to the control panel. So I'll start typing control panel. Once I open that, I'm going to go to the system and security settings here. System security. Okay, system security. I'm going to then look for allow remote access in my system area. So system, allow remote access. In here, I'm going to, under remote desktop, we're going to allow remote connections. Okay, so remote, we're going to allow remote connections to this PC. It's giving you a little warning, okay? We're going to allow that, and we're going to say apply, okay. Now, this other PC does already have an account on, that student account, so we will need to provide those credentials to get access to it, but that's what I'm going to allow. Now, remember, it's on this PC over here. I'm actually on this one right now. I showed you the process, but I need to make sure I do it on this PC. And that should set up my remote access in my network. We'll have remote access to the switches via telnet, remote access to the routers via SSH, and we'll have remote access to this PC over here via RDP. And that's going to allow us to look at these protocols in the network and see which ones might be vulnerable and which ones might be more secure. That's what that's going to allow us to do here in a little bit. All right, we'll come back in the next podcast and start testing these connections and testing these protocols.